Imagine stepping into a new role without a single rule book, a single blueprint, or a single predecessor. This was the monumental task facing George Washington in April 1789 as he assumed the office of the presidency. For the first time, a nation would put its brand new constitution to the test. Could this founding document actually work in practice? And on a deeper level, could one man solve a nation's immense problems, from crippling debt to internal political disputes and rising international tensions? This is the story of how Washington, through his leadership, laid the very foundations of the American government and set precedents that echo even today. In 1789, the details of the presidency were far from clear. In this vacuum, nearly every decision Washington made could be established as a lasting tradition. His choice to deliver an inaugural address, for instance, became a rite of passage for every future American president. He also insisted on being addressed with the simple title of Mr. President, rejecting more formal, king-like titles such as Your Excellency. To run the new government, Washington established the first cabinet, an assembly of key advisors. He selected John Adams as his vice president, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Even these roles were still undefined. Vice President Adams, for example, complained that he was tasked with the two most pointless jobs ever conceived, both Vice President and President of the Senate. One of Washington's most urgent priorities was to empower the judiciary. It was the least defined branch in the Constitution. But with the Judiciary Act of 1789, Washington helped shape its form. He appointed John Jay as its first Chief Justice and created a system of lower district courts, with presidential appointments to uphold and enforce federal law. The structure Washington put in place remains the basis of the modern federal court system. While Washington was building the government, the public was focused on one pressing concern: protecting individual rights. The original Constitution had no clear provisions for personal liberties, a fact that its critics had used against it during the ratification process. States like Massachusetts had only agreed to the Constitution on the condition that such a Bill of Rights would be added. Washington agreed, and in his inaugural speech, he called for basic rights to be impregnably fortified in a new constitutional amendment. Although support for a Bill of Rights was not universal, the voices of its opponents were soon overwhelmed. Largely thanks to the work of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, a Bill of Rights was introduced to Congress in September 1789. This series of 10 distinct amendments included protections for religious freedom, freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, and the right to bear arms. Over the next 2 years, these amendments were ratified by the states, becoming an enshrined part of the Constitution in December 1791. At the same time, the young nation was expanding its physical footprint. Washington oversaw the admission of 3 new states: Vermont in 1791, Kentucky in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796. The Constitution had anticipated such growth, and Americans expected the country to continue to expand. However, these successes were overshadowed by a series of disastrous military campaigns in the Northwest Territories during Washington's first years in office. Since the passage of the Northwest Ordinance, indigenous groups had fiercely and successfully resisted the American settlers pouring into their lands. As a former military commander with a new set of presidential powers, Washington made dealing with these challenges one of his first acts. Secretary of War Henry Knox agreed, and they dispatched General Josiah Harmer to lead a campaign in the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Indian War proved to be far more difficult than Washington had anticipated. A diverse alliance of Native American groups, with quiet backing from the British, proved a formidable adversary for the untested American soldiers. Harmer's objective was to destroy Native American settlements and drive out their warriors. But on October 21, 1790, his men were met with a devastating defeat at the Battle of Kekionga. The losses were immense, and surviving soldiers described a scene of overwhelming carnage. Determined to reverse this setback, Washington then ordered Major General Arthur St. Clair to launch a new military campaign. On November 4, 1791, as St. Clair's army advanced on native settlements along the Wabash River in Ohio, they were ambushed by over 1,000 indigenous warriors led by the Miami War chief Little Turtle. The engagement became known as St. Clair's Defeat. More than 600 American soldiers lost their lives, making it the single greatest defeat the United States had ever suffered at the hands of Native American forces. With a fatality rate of over 60%, it was also, proportionally, the worst defeat the U.S. Army had ever endured in a major engagement. Washington placed the blame squarely on St. Clair. The controversy prompted Congress to launch its first-ever official investigation into the executive branch, with a committee concluding that Secretary Knox had failed to properly supply the Army. Ultimately, no one was held accountable. Instead, Washington and Congress used the disaster to expand the Army, increase military pay, and pass the Militia Acts, which forcibly enrolled all able-bodied men into their state militias, ready to be called upon when needed. Fortunately for Washington, his administration's efforts in other areas were far more successful, especially in matters of finance and the economy. His appointment of Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary proved to be one of the best decisions he ever made. Hamilton was an astute, brilliant, and ambitious man, and he took on the immense task of organizing the nation's financial affairs. Hamilton's approach began by combining the nation's debt into a single federal debt that the United States could then begin to repay, in order to prove its financial credibility to creditors. To ensure the government had more funds at its disposal, he issued government bonds and put new tariffs and taxes into place. Hamilton also spearheaded the establishment of the U.S. Mint to create a standardized national currency. His economic initiatives expanded federal power, much to the anger of many states, especially in the South, who were wary of consolidating authority in a distant capital. To gain the support of these hesitant Southerners, Hamilton offered a major compromise. The Southern states would agree to his reforms in exchange for the capital being relocated southward to a new site along the Potomac River, which would later become Washington, D.C. This pivotal agreement in 1790 convinced the South to support Hamilton's plans, including the federal assumption of state debts. The ultimate achievement of Hamilton's financial overhaul was the Bank of the United States, which was officially chartered in 1791. It oversaw the nation's debt, issued loans to both the government and private citizens, and printed banknotes, among other key financial responsibilities. Critics argued that the bank was an unconstitutional expansion of government authority, but Washington stood by Hamilton's plans as a necessary and appropriate tool for the new nation. While Washington largely supported Hamilton's work, one man who did not was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Hamilton represented two fundamentally different visions for the new government. Hamilton championed a powerful federal government with the broad authority to promote trade and expand the nation's wealth. Jefferson, however, favored a more limited federal government that was in line with the Revolution's original goals. And he was a strong advocate for states' rights and the agricultural values of small landowners. In 1789, Hamilton created America's first official political party, the Federalist Party, to serve as a platform for his ideas and those of his allies. 2 years later, in 1791, Jefferson and James Madison responded by founding their own Democratic-Republican Party. Washington generally leaned towards the Federalists, but he deeply regretted the bitter political division that was growing under his leadership. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans clashed over nearly every major issue of the day. The Federalists lined up behind Hamilton's economic reforms, while the Democratic Republicans condemned them as being tyrannical. When the French Revolution began in 1789, the Democratic Republicans welcomed it as an inspiring echo of their own revolutionary ideals while the Federalists saw it as a radical and destructive endeavor that lacked the restraint of the American Revolution. Few issues passed through Congress or crossed the president's desk without inspiring a heated argument between the two groups. In 1793, Jefferson resigned from his position as Secretary of State after a 4-year term. However, he continued to be heavily involved in politics, organizing opposition to various Federalist causes over the next 3 years. Among the many controversial initiatives Hamilton championed for his economic program was the whiskey tax of 1791, which placed a tax on the production and sale of spirits. The tax was widely hated, and citizens evaded it whenever they could. In 1794, when officials in Pennsylvania attempted to enforce the tax, local distillers met them with force. This act of aggression opened the door to widespread civil unrest. Recalling how Shays' Rebellion years earlier had paralyzed the previous federal government, Washington was determined not to allow such weakness in the new system. The Militia Acts, passed in the wake of the earlier military defeats, allowed the president to mobilize a staggering 13,000 men. Washington personally led the army to confront the rebels, who dispersed immediately in the face of such a show of overwhelming power. The strong response to the Whiskey Rebellion stood in stark contrast to the powerlessness seen in the government's response to earlier uprisings. At the same time that Washington was mobilizing the militia, the United States finally gained the upper hand in the Northwest Indian War. After a clear victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August 1794, indigenous groups were forced to seek a negotiated peace. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 saw the Native Americans concede American control of the Northwest Territory and brought an end to major hostilities in the region. With success against both armed rebels and Native American forces, the new federal government had proven that it was capable of handling crises that had crippled the previous system. Washington also proved adept at navigating the treacherous waters of foreign policy. When the French Revolution swept across France, he remained publicly silent. To Jefferson's frustration, the Democratic Republicans believed America should enthusiastically support the French, just as France had supported them during their own revolution. However, Washington and the Federalists were not convinced of the leadership or restraint of their French counterparts. When the French Revolutionary Wars erupted between France and Britain in 1792, the French urged the Americans to join them, citing the 1778 Franco-American alliance. The French wanted America to attack British ships as part of a shared Republican effort. Jefferson, ever the Francophile, was in complete agreement. Washington, however, was firmly against involving America in an unnecessary overseas conflict. He knew that trade with Britain was essential to the American economy and did not want to alienate them. He also argued that the 1778 alliance had been signed with King Louis XVI, whom the revolutionaries had just executed. Surely, the treaty was no longer valid. To maintain peace, Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, publicly declaring that the United States would not take sides in the French or British conflicts. In anger, the French envoy, Edmond Charles Genet, attempted to recruit Americans to join the conflict anyway. Washington complained to France and had Genet recalled, but upon learning that the new revolutionary government would likely have him executed, Washington granted Genet sanctuary instead. The resulting breakdown in relations with France was a blow to Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Relations with other European powers, however, improved. In 1794, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to negotiate the Jay Treaty, which secured the British evacuation of forts in the disputed Northwest Territory and established formal trade relations. The following year, Pinckney's treaty settled disputes with Spain, restoring American navigation rights to the Mississippi and defining the border between American and Spanish territory. By the time Washington's second term was coming to an end in 1796, it was clear he had done an admirable job. Many, including John Adams, expected him to remain in office for the rest of his life, and had he wanted to, he likely could have. However, Washington was a man of principle above all else. Just as he had done with his military commission in 1783, he was ready to set aside his power when the time came. In doing so, he established the traditional two-term limit that would bind nearly every future president. Washington left behind a robust system, one ready to meet the immense challenges of the future. But it was also a system torn by a bitter political division that would only worsen as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson began their fierce competition to inherit his office. The new republic was just beginning its journey. We hope this video has given you a deeper understanding of the monumental legacy of George Washington. His story is more than just a list of facts. It's a powerful lesson in leadership, sacrifice, and the enduring human effort to build something great from nothing. If you found this animated history compelling, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Your support helps us continue to bring history to life in an engaging way. Don't forget to comment with your thoughts, and stay tuned for our next animated documentary.